10, 12, 14. Very good. How many auditors? One. And Marco was supposed to be auditing. He's not here. You're all welcome anyway. 60 years in the making, lecture 2. I mentioned earlier as well, sorry to repeat myself, but for those who recently arrived, we will have a group-led seminar after the break this evening to discuss the readings on Egypt. And also in the second half of this evening's class, we will pair you up into study groups so that you can coordinate your material. Do you have enough room there on the corner?
Yeah.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
If there's a bag in the way, just drag it out and pull your chair in. It seems to be obviously, in looking at any country over a 60-year period, there are going to be an awful lot of, good evening, things that one cannot include in 45 minutes or less, which is why I hope you all read the 13 pages of notes I've been typing up over the past few weeks. But considering Egypt since independence in 1952, although of course it received independence in 1922, but it's only really after 52 that was a practical independence, I have just selected 3 words: militarism, Islamism, and democracy, ? And that will do us between 1952 and 2011 and the Arab Spring, so-called. I'm sorry about the number of words on this slide. I'm going to stand aside for a second. I hate lots and lots of text, but I wanted the outline to be firm in your minds, because I know it's really nice at the start of a presentation to know where we're all going. So we will have an introduction and then 3 body parts of the lecture. It's really nice and easy in the case of Egypt, because you just go through the 3 presidents that existed. And actually, it's not fair, there were 4, but we'll hear more about that. The 3 main presidents in Egypt from independence until the ouster of Mubarak. These terms I've put on are obviously not terms by which the presidents describe themselves, but rather some choice words of my own. And then our conclusion. Egypt 2011, eve of a revolution, which is rather a nice sandwich, the introduction and conclusion being similar pieces of bread, both eves of the revolution. Okay. Now, if I stand here and you can't see anything on these slides that's important, please don't hesitate to yell or wave or something. So here we are, the introduction. Is quite all right? Are you okay? You're trying to leave already?
No.
Somebody's tunnelling out. You know we're on the 5th floor. You should go by the window. A map. Gotta love maps. Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. This was the state of the country between 1899 and 1956. A single country under British control that ran from the Mediterranean down to what is still the bottom of South Sudan today. So 3 modern nations in one condominium, that is a collection of countries put together by the British. In the Sudan and in Egypt, the British were there largely, they claimed, in an advisory capacity. It was rather nice that you have the Khedif, or king, or pasha, in charge of Egypt, and he does whatever he's told by his British advisors very much in inverted commas. The Nile obviously is central to Egypt. It ties the whole country together. We mentioned that before. When we look at regional security threats in lecture 10, I think it is, water rights is obviously going to be significant, because that is as important as any other kind of security threat in the region. I mean, terrorists and Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb are all very well and good, and they're headline-grabbing elements when things blow up. But the quietly running waters of that river are going to see a fair amount of squabbling in the years ahead. The flag of the rulers of Egypt, or the Anglo-Egyptian Sudanese condominium. This is the official flag. Anybody recognize it? Is it familiar? based on the Turkish flag, of course, because it was Ottoman. So at this time, it's doubly occupied. Egyptians are really, nowhere to be seen in all this. There's a foreign ruler. I mean, we talk about the king or the Khedive of Egypt, but he's not Egyptian per se. He's an Ottoman Turk in charge. And above him, you have the British in charge. So there are all these people in charge, but none of them are Egyptians. This led to a lot of soul-searching in the early 20th century in Egypt. People started to wonder, why is it that we're so far behind? Egypt, a great culture, an ancient culture with much to recommend it. Suddenly we're occupied by both Turks, who are non-Arabic speaking foreigners, and by the British, obviously non-Arabic speaking foreigners. People looked around, numerous people came up with the answer that, well, we're not sufficiently religious. This is the first wave of Islamism, started in the late 19th century. There was a character in Sudan who led a revolt, if you like, against foreign occupation, very much inspired by religious fervour, the Mahdi. You've probably heard this term, or a Messiah figure in Islam, and he said that he was the Mahdi, the precursor of the end times in Islam. When he died of typhus and the end days didn't appear, his claims were seen to be rather wide of the mark. But it's important throughout the 20th century that as Arab nations in North Africa and beyond look at themselves with a degree of introspection that wasn't there in the early 19th century, they start to turn, in many cases, to Islam. The other thing people turn to later in the 20th century is Arab nationalism, about which more later. Muhammad Ali. He was the ruler. I don't know that slide, sorry. That R for reign, obviously. I use R a lot for the years of his reign. Not to be confused with the world's greatest boxer, of course, Muhammad Ali, who, I don't know if he took his name from the ruler of Egypt or not, but this is the Muhammad Ali we're going to focus on this evening. As I said, he was an Ottoman Turk. He's not an Egyptian. His was the longest reign of any ruler of Egypt. He's Albanian. If you're ever involved in a pub quiz and you have to name 3 famous Albanians, Muhammad Ali is always a great one to have on hand. Another one is Mother Teresa of Calcutta, and King Zog is the third one with that wonderful name Z-O-G. But this is Muhammad Ali. Important for us, but not as important as this man who brings us right up to the start of our period in question. King Farouk reigned 1936 to 1952. He was the 10th in line after Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali took control of Egypt in the late 19th century, and this was the great grandson of Muhammad Ali, the 10th. So we're still looking at what many Egyptians consider to be foreign ruler, King Farouk. I mean, to the Western press, to an American writing in the New York Times in the 1930s or 40s, or the London Times for that matter, he's the ruler of Egypt, he's an Egyptian, right? They're all the same. Who can tell? Well, the Egyptians could tell very clearly. He was supported by the British, who he disliked vehemently. During the Second World War, Farouk was writing to the High Command in Germany, which I'm sure you'll all know, and you don't have to tell me, it was led by one Adolf Hitler. He was telling Hitler that he thought an invasion of Egypt by Germans would be a fine idea. He hated the British so much, but he relied on them for his support. So that was Farouk. He was opposed by the Americans, at least after the war. He didn't trust them. There was a CIA plot. I put this up just to remind myself. There was a CIA plot to remove Farouk from power. Has anybody heard the name Kermit Roosevelt? It's kind of a curious name, Kermit, like the frog. Kermit Roosevelt was the grandson of President Teddy Roosevelt. If you ever study Iran, Kermit Roosevelt has a much more prominent role there in the overthrow of Mossadegh, the freely elected ruler of Iran who was overthrown in the CIA plot. Well, before he was involved in Iran, he was involved here in Egypt, and there was a plot which Kermit Roosevelt apparently himself, in the offices of the CIA, started to push the term. It was called Project FF, which, without too fine a point on it, stands for Project Fat Fuck, which is what he and the other members of the CIA thought of King Farouk. So there's your view of the Egyptian king from this side of the water. And Farouk was disliked by the Egyptians, who he disdained. He had no real regard. During the Second World War, Farouk lived in great luxury, as kings are wont to do. There were blackouts all over Egypt imposed by the British during the war so that German planes and others couldn't bomb significant and important sites, railway yards, centres of industry. King Farouk kept his palace well lit at night, hoping, and indeed we understand from telegrams, encouraging the Germans to come over and bomb his own people. Not going to endear you. And this is the flag he used, a take on the Ottoman flag. The introduction of green was an indicator of a move towards Islam, which Farouk hoped would win him some popularity in the country. But alas for Farouk, it did not do so. Farouk was got rid of in very short order. And I know we've jumped right onto Nasser, but don't worry, I won't miss any important bits of the story. Part 1 then. Nasser, charisma, patriotism and autocracy. As you know, I like to give you a little bit of background, so why don't we go back more than 2,000 years to Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, the Macedonian, the Greek, invaded Egypt in 332. We dealt with this last week. Went to consult with the oracle at Siwa. When Alexander the Great came in, he overthrew an Egyptian ruler. Now, I'm not going to dwell on ancient history, but I just want you to look at that date. He reigned in Egypt from 332 until his death in 323 BC. So after the Egyptian Revolution of 1952, from that period, from Alexander the Great until the revolution in 52, not a single Egyptian had ruled over Egypt. It's quite a staggering statistic. There were Ottoman Turks, there were Mamluks, they were from all over the place, but there were no native Egyptians. You can see why the revolution was quite so popular. It was an amazing moment in modern Egyptian history. And it was against the backdrop of this thing called Arab nationalism. Suddenly, Arabs were taking control of their own countries, throwing off the yoke of foreign powers, whether those powers be fellow Muslims or infidel Europeans. 1956, the Sudan gains independence. And that's why we have on this map the red of Egypt alone. I mentioned 3 presidents earlier, Nasser, Sadat and Mubarak. Of course, now we have President Morsi, who many people assume is the 4th, but actually he's the 5th president of Egypt, because this man was the first president of Egypt, now rather neglected and overlooked in history. General Mohammed Naguib. He was the first president. He was one of the gang of young officers, the Free Officers they called their movement, along with Nasser and Sadat, 3 of the ringleaders, if you will, who led the coup, the revolution against Farouk. After 2 years, he was sidelined by the more politically wily Nasser. Nasser had grand plans. Nasser's grand plans were for one-party rule. Naguib often wrote about true democracy, about allowing for multi-party elections, about the army standing back, leaving politics to the people. And after 2 years of talking about this, he found himself on the outs. Nasser sidelined him, and he spent the rest of his life living under house arrest in Egypt. So that's Naguib. Interesting character, as I say, for his pro-democracy outlook, at least his avowed pro-democracy outlook, and one wonders what might have happened to Egypt through the 60s and 70s had Naguib's desire to see parliamentary democracy be introduced, had it come to pass. But that's supposition. The Egyptian flag with one notable difference. What do we see? Crossed swords. Is this typical of a civilian flag? Not so much. This was and remains the flag of the Egyptian army. People talk about the revolution in Egypt in 1952, but it was no such thing. There was no revolution in Egypt in 1952. It was a military coup, pure and simple. If Naguib had had his way, perhaps it would have been a revolution. Perhaps if they had introduced free elections and multi-party democracy, that would have been the case. But when Nasser took over, he abolished all political parties. They set up something which was supposed to represent a political party, but it was run by the generals. From that point until, I argue, the fall of Mubarak, the military was still pretty much in charge of Egypt in one shape or form. So there he is as a young man. Quite striking looks as well. Could have been a film star, I reckon, in the 1950s. If you've seen the old black and white Egyptian movies, that he was a very typical sort of looking character. Gamal Abdel Nasser. It was charisma that got him through. Charisma and a willingness to stamp on anybody else that got in his way. He was ruthless. Autocracy is a word that could have been invented for him. He was not about to let the Egyptian peasantry have a say in the running of their own country. This was not his way. He ruled by fiat. So let's consider Nasser through the lens of some events. Again, in trying to cover 60 or more years of history, there are certain aspects that we will glide over. But I think these events are rather interesting, representative, and worth picking apart in a little detail. The Suez Crisis of 1956, the union of Egypt with Syria, which lasted between 1958 and 1961, Egyptians being dragged into the civil war in Yemen between 1962 and 1970, the so-called Six-Day War in 1967, and then finally Nasser's resignation, reinstatement, and sudden death. The Suez Crisis. You all know about the Suez Canal. I'm sure I don't have to labour the point that when the Suez Canal was opened in 1869, it made it a great deal easier for Europeans to get to the Far East. It was an Anglo-French project to build the canal, and you can just see in the greyed out area of the map the bottom of the British Isles. You can see what a difference it makes for any ship leaving the port of Southampton or Dover to come through the Strait of Gibraltar, across the Mediterranean and through the Suez to India, which is behind us here, as opposed to having to go all the way around the Cape. Cut thousands of miles off the journey time. And the British and the French guarded it very jealously. So, what happened? 56. It's the Cold War. It's often forgotten in all of these dates that the Cold War was raging across the globe. So right now, America and the Soviet Union are facing off against each other, trying to score points, trying to win friends and allies. Now, Nasser was keen to try and belong to something which we now know as the non-aligned movement. He was trying to stay out of global politics and just say Egypt for the Egyptians, Egypt first. It wasn't going to work. America had promised Nasser a great deal of money to build the dam at Aswan. Then Nasser played a hand where he started buying weapons from the Soviet Union. He used Czechoslovakia as the intermediary to make it sound as though it wasn't quite as serious as the Americans would believe. But the Americans believed it to be very serious indeed, and withdrew all of their funding for the building of the dam. You can see how seemingly innocuous events can lead to major crises in the world. So suddenly Nasser is stuck with this dam about to be built. There's no money forthcoming. So what does he do? He nationalises the Suez Canal. The canal is a British-owned company. British and French own the company. He takes it over. He says it's on Egyptian land, we own it, and the profits that we get from letting shipping pass through, we will use to build the dam. So thank you, America, we don't need your help. America more or less backs away at this point, thinking, oh well, done deal. We just have to keep an eye on the Soviet weapons going in. That's more important to us. Britain, France, and their ally Israel have a very different view of things. They're terrified that with the Egyptians running the Suez Canal, they could block it to international shipping. And so Britain, France, and Israel hatch a plot that Israel will invade Sinai, and then Britain and France will invade Egypt in order to protect the canal. I mean, If you put it down as a plot for a Hollywood movie, you'd think it was a bit exaggerated, nobody would buy it, but that's exactly what they did. So the three nations, Britain, France and Israel, all came in around the Suez Canal area, took it over without much of a fight, but then the Americans and the Soviet Union both said, no you don't, you're going to have to leave, I'm afraid. We're not allowing people to go in and knock Egypt around in the canal. It's a very rare example of America and the Soviet Union agreeing on something during the Cold War, but the United Nations they voted the same way. It's a very, very rare thing. Nasser came out of this the hero, not just in Egypt but across the Arab world. He made it look as though, and I suppose to a degree he had, stood up to the rest of the world, the great power of Britain, France and Israel. And he'd won. This was something that Arabs weren't used to doing, winning. He was seen as a hero for all the nations. And there he is in a heroic pose. I think that's sufficiently heroic. Chin jutting forward, man of destiny look. This is how Nasser would always like to imagine himself. But alas, things didn't always go according to plan. Syria, 1958. The government of Syria are worried about being taken over by communists. Again, it's a Cold War story being fought out in the Middle East. The Syrians basically strong-arm Nasser into a union. He's not keen at first, but because he's just come out of the Suez crisis, as it's known in England, I've got a story playing in my mind, but I'll save it for the break. Because he's just come out of the Suez crisis and sees himself as a great hero, he thinks, well, maybe I could be a leader of the entire Arab world. Seriously, he was considering a union with many Arab nations. The Yemen signed on to this thing, but didn't formalise, so they weren't part of the union. The two stars on this flag represent one for Egypt and one for Syria. So for 3 years, Egypt ceased to exist, and Syria ceased to exist as independent nations. There was the United Arab Republic, the UAR. If you're a collector of money or stamps, you can still find them out there. UAR currency, UAR stamps. And Nasser was the president of the union. As I say, there were plans for Yemen to join, there were plans for Libya to join. But the union was flawed from day one. Why? Because Egypt and Syria are very different countries with very different backgrounds. Syria in the 1950s had a thriving tradition of mercantilism. Syria was run not by bureaucrats but by businessmen. There were more small businesses in Syria perhaps than any other Arab nation at that time. Whereas in Egypt everything was state-controlled from the centre. Nasser's hand was heavy on Egypt. So Syrians very soon started complaining that suddenly they've got an Egyptian president, they've got Egyptian laws and a foreign-imposed constitution, which has completely upended the natural order of Syrian society. So after 3 years, the Syrians just tear up the agreement and walk away. Syria did, however, keep the flag, and it's still the Syrian flag today. And United Arab Republic, the title for this union, was kept by Egypt until 1971. Nasser believed that his charisma would persuade the Syrians to rejoin the union, but he was proved wrong for the second time. The war in Yemen, this is often overlooked, I think, in general surveys of the Middle East. There was a split in the Yemen, communist powers operating in the south, monarchy in the north. Again, it's another Cold War story. It's fascinating how much of this is Cold War history. So, the Egyptians go in and they spend a lot of money. That's what happens in wars. Egypt was doing pretty well after nationalisation of the Suez Canal. The economy was rising. There was too much central control. The state did control too many aspects of Egyptian society and business. But the coffers were full until this war. After 8 years of a bleeding war in Yemen, Egypt was nearly broke. At the end of it, Yemen remained divided. I mean, the Yemen only reunited in 1990, as the figures here show you. People's Republic, I should say, the one coloured red is the communist one. things that tend to call themselves People's Republic tend to be on the communist side of things. So this was another strategic error on Nasser's part, thinking that he could dominate another part of the world. And so this was a gamble of Nasser's, the Six-Day War, an attempt to regain prestige he'd lost in Yemen. Now this event is a lot more clearly understood and a lot more clearly documented than perhaps the war in Yemen. Israel was and remains the regional superpower, I suppose one could say, in terms of its military. The Israeli troops were better armed, they were better trained, and, well, you can see the title, Six-Day War. It didn't take long for them to demonstrate this fact. All of the Sinai Peninsula, the canal obviously is here, and for those who don't know Egypt, the canal is actually two canals, one from Mediterranean down to the Bitter Lakes. There's the Great Bitter Lake and the Lesser Bitter Lake, and then there's another stretch of canal here, the southern exit of which comes into the Red Sea. So in 6 days, Israel had overrun Sinai Peninsula. They were at the Suez Canal. They had everything they wanted. They could have kept going. There was talk of Israel marching on to Cairo. But again, in these days of the Cold War, foreign powers intervened to halt their progress. But this was devastating not just for the loss of tens of thousands of Egyptian soldiers killed, but it was a real slap in the face to Nasser. From being a hero in the Arab world, he was made to look like a fool. People in the Middle East still talk about 67 as a great tragedy. It seems like a long way ago to us, perhaps. But you still see people in Midan Tahrir, in fact, holding up signs referring to 67 and how they have to reclaim Egyptian pride after the 67 war. I mean, these were in Tahrir Square in 2011, January, people holding up signs referring to the 67 war, something which you wouldn't think had much to do with the revolution or ouster of Mubarak. But it was a devastating blow to Egypt and to Nasser most of all. So Nasser resigned. Now, some historians say it was a great act of humility. He recognised he'd made a mistake and he resigned and he wanted no more to do with it. I think that more historians agree that it was a ploy on his part. Because when he resigned, there were mass demonstrations, primarily in Cairo, Alexandria, but also in the cities along the Suez Canal. And these mass demonstrations are organised by his party, the party in Egypt. So I think that the resignation was a ploy. He, after the demands of the people, agreed very humbly to become their president once more. And then, almost suddenly as it had all started, he was dead, 1970. Died of a heart attack. He was a lifelong, very heavy smoker, as I suppose most people were in the 50s and 60s. He had had 2 heart attacks already while in power, but the only person who knew about these was his doctor. So when he died in 1970, he had gone some way to re-establishing his reputation as a man of action. This photograph is of his funeral, by the way, in Cairo. It's one of the biggest turnouts of people ever recorded. Some 4 million Egyptians turned out for his funeral. And we'll see later what the population of Egypt was in 1970, just to put that in perspective. I think the 2 characteristics that we can take away from the rule of Nasser are his one-party rule and his intolerance for religious groups. He was intolerant of all opposition groups. He was intolerant of any opponents. But the religious groups in particular suffered under Nasser. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the name Hassan al-Banna, founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in 1928 in the Egyptian city of Ismailia, which is along the Suez Canal. It's a modern city. It was only built in 1863. The French founded the city. If you ever go to Ismailia, you'll see lots of very European-looking chalets and French-looking housing rather than anything Egyptian. It's because the French built it for their senior staff, senior management of the Suez Canal. It's interesting to note that now there is a state of emergency has been reimposed in 3 cities in Egypt. They are Port Said, Suez, and Ismailia, 3 centres of most opposition to a Muslim Brotherhood president. I don't know, it's just things go around in a funny way. From the founding city of the Muslim Brotherhood to the city that the Muslim Brotherhood now having a curfew. So as founder and leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna was an obvious candidate for Nasser's ire. When he died, al-Banna, it was an assassination on the street in Cairo. People have long said that it was Nasser who was responsible, or one of his cronies, not Nasser personally. And it's most likely the case, but whatever evidence people produce, none of it is conclusive enough. And the other man who we saw last week in our names and faces round was this man, Sayyid Qutb, a theoretician of Islamist politics. He's the man whose work is still being read today, particularly his book, which translated in English as Milestones. If you want to read a single text, a founding text, a founding document for Islamism in 20th and 21st century politics, read Milestones by this man, Sayyid Qutb. You can see he died at the age of 60. I don't know if he smoked or not, but he didn't have the opportunity for a heart attack to get him because the Egyptian government hanged him. It was a swifter end. I can't remember who it was here last week guessed this was Sayyid Qutb because the photograph I showed had him behind bars. It's very typical kind of giveaway. Rather comical moustache, in my opinion, but that's by the by. So Sayyid Qutb executed, Hassan al-Banna assassinated. Nasser, next to the Sphinx. We're going to talk about Sadat in a minute, but it's interesting how Egyptians still hark back to their ancient roots. And Nasser saw himself very much as in the line of pharaohs. He didn't believe at all in parliamentary democracy. Why not have all the power? I mean, I took power, why shouldn't I keep it? I think was Nasser's attitude. And we'll see a similar thing with Sadat. So Sadat, the promise of peace, but not prosperity. Again, we're going to focus just briefly on a few events to give us a colour of Sadat's reign. The Yom Kippur, also known as the October War of 1973, it's called the Yom Kippur War because it was launched on the Jewish festival of Yom Kippur. The Infitah, or opening, Infitah, Arabic word which means opening. It's a reference to economic policies, an open door policy in terms of liberalising the economy. After Nasser, anything would be liberal in terms of the economy, so it was no great shakes. The Infitah leads directly to the bread riots of 1977. And then we have Sadat's visit to Israel, very important moment in modern Israeli and Egyptian history, followed the next year by the Camp David Accords, and then Sadat's assassination in 1981. All of those items, by the way, if you didn't write them down, they'll come up again on the slides as we go through, so don't panic. And again, the slides will be on Blackboard tomorrow, so feel free to use and abuse them at your leisure. We're going to talk about the Egyptian military after the break. And the Egyptian military rated themselves pretty highly. That's because Nasser was a military man, and now Sadat, he was a military man, and Mubarak was a military man. Mubarak with the Air Force, the other two with the army. With military rule over the country, I suppose it's inevitable that the armed forces had a rather inflated idea of their abilities. Initially, during the October War of 73, the Egyptians did make some advances, but ultimately they were as lost as they were in the earlier conflict. We'll look, as I said, the military after the break, and we'll also look at the military later on in this series of, later on in the course, I should say. But the significant thing here is that Sadat, it is thought, was trying to build up his reputation. Nasser was charismatic, and you meet people with charisma, and they whatever they do, it doesn't go wrong. They can fall on their faces, people still think they're doing a great job. Sadat didn't have the charisma. Sadat needed big gestures to make Egyptians fall in love with him. This didn't work. I would not for a second want to suggest that Sadat was not an autocrat. He was. He was just slightly less autocratic than was Nasser before him. Sadat started trying to loose the reins of political power. Political parties were allowed as long as Sadat approved them. So it's this kind of fine line between saying you can have all the freedom you want as long as it's within limits. That was Sadat's idea. And the Infitah, Egypt needed to do something. Its economy was in a disastrous state by this time. All these foreign wars, the lack of trade with nations of the region, particularly Israel, which is still a sticking point. Trade between Egypt and Israel is so small at the moment, it's ridiculous. You've got a huge market right next door, underutilized on both sides. So Infitah, or the open door policy, or Sadat's attempt to liberalize the Egyptian economy. He was pushed into this to a degree by the IMF and the World Bank. They promised loans and they promised budget support and they made all sorts of promises if he would liberalize the economy. But you can't go from one economic state to another overnight, which is exactly what Sadat tried to do. The bread riots in Cairo killed, I think, 80 people. The reason there were bread riots was because the government subsidized flour, olive oil, heating fuel. The IMF said you have to get rid of subsidies. So the government dropped subsidies overnight. Now, you don't get millions of people on the streets protesting if they're not really serious about this. The difference between a few pennies, piastres, cents, between the price of a pita bread, which is the staple diet of Egyptians then and now, the difference in that loss of a few piastres of government subsidies would mean the difference between starving to death or staying alive. It was too much, too soon for his open door policy. Mubarak after him liberalised in a much slower fashion, which was why we saw fewer, but there were still protests, fewer demonstrations against the government because they kept the subsidies in place. Now, the subsidies kept in place today, or rather under Mubarak, were only in place because of steps that Sadat put into place. And he may not have known it at the time, but it was this visit of Sadat to Israel. This is him after speaking to the Israeli parliament, or Knesset, shaking hands with the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. It was this visit to Israel which essentially allowed the Egyptian government to continue paying subsidies on flour. Because following this visit to Israel and the Camp David Accords of the following year, the American government started paying Egypt somewhere in the region of $2 billion a year. That's significant. The money's also being given to Israel. Now, it should be said, in the case of Egypt, the majority of the funds coming from America to Egypt, which were often supposed to be in budget support, actually went into the pockets of the armed forces. So the Egyptian army was able to build up a great deal of stock, most of it bought from American companies, it should be said, but then those were the terms of the agreement that was pushed through at Camp David. I think most significantly, though, with the Camp David Accords, Egypt and Israel were no longer at a state of war. Although they hadn't been fighting for some time, they remained at a de facto state of war. And a state of war means a wartime economy. And a wartime economy means a great deal of spending on things that you can't eat. And for the Egyptian people, this was a very big problem. So, yes, the peace with Israel was imperfect. Yes, it remains a very cold peace. But what it has done, and I think the reason why the agreement remains in place under the Muslim Brotherhood today, is because they realise, love or hate Israel, They can't afford to be at a state of war with that country. Now, if the Muslim Brotherhood took this peace accord tomorrow, I'm not suggesting that the troops would go rushing over the border and invade Israel. I don't think so for a minute. But the first thing it would trigger, if there's a de facto state of war, is a wartime economy. And as anybody who reads the newspapers know, the economy of Egypt is in free fall at the moment. And they cannot afford spending on their military. Sadat, I should say, had always promised, let's say that again, there was an agreement among all the leaders of the Arab world in the 1970s that nobody would speak to Israel. We all stand together as Arab Muslim nations. If nobody talks to Israel, that's fine. We're a strong bloc. United we stand. Sadat, obviously, here, President Carter in the middle, Prime Minister Begin of Israel here, shaking hands. They signed an agreement. Sadat did exactly what he promised not to do. He came to an agreement on his own for Egypt and for Egypt's interests with Israel. I think it was a very brave decision. And as I say, of course, the peace was imperfect, but I have a soft spot for Sadat for his pursuit of peace in that time. Yes, it was imperfect, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't try and make efforts in that direction. The rest of the Arab world, of course, hated him. Many Egyptians hated him because he'd gone against the promise. He had spoken to the Zionist entity, as people refer to Israel, who can't bear to say the name. And so, I suppose his assassination was inevitable. Can anybody tell me who's that young man on the left? Mubarak, in his Air Force uniform. Yes, Mubarak, Sadat's vice president, in the same way that Sadat was vice president to Nasser. October, 6th of October, significant. Remember the October War? Every year there's a military parade in Cairo, which commemorates the October War. And this is Mubarak and Sadat there at the viewing platform. Does everybody recognize this man? Can somebody tell me why we recognize him? Anybody?
World Trade War.
Right, from 93. He wasn't the one who planted the explosives, but he was responsible for the planning. What's his nickname? The Blind Sheikh, exactly. You've heard reference to the Blind Sheikh. This is he, Omar Abdul Rahman. He's been around for a long time. You see, in America, we know him for the planning and encouragement of those to carry out the attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. But he was the man that issued the fatwa against Sadat before Sadat's assassination. You know, this guy's got a long history of pushing his view of the world and how things should be done. So he was the one that signed off, that said it was theologically permissible to assassinate the president because he had made this agreement with Israel. And this photograph, is it clear enough? I'm not sure that the colours are very good there. Can you see it okay or not? Let me turn the light out for a second. This is outside the American Embassy in Cairo today. I mean, this wasn't taken today, I took it last year, but the banners are still there. It's a demonstration asking for the release of Abdul Rahman. You've heard talk as well that President Morsi is apparently in... Was that the light that was on before? Is that good? Is that slightly better? President Morsi has apparently asked for Abdul Rahman to be released into Egyptian custody. Morsi has clarified his comments by saying he doesn't believe, or he's not going to release him from prison, but on humanitarian grounds he would like him kept in an Egyptian rather than an American prison. But it's another story for another day. So this is a still from the very dramatic film from October 1981. This is the assassination of Sadat. During the military parade, there's a flypast. The jets go overhead. Mubarak and Sadat look up. Suddenly, a jeep stops. Men jump out the back, rush the viewing platform, and, as you can see, sprayed it with gunfire. Mubarak got an injury in his hand, right hand I think it was. Sadat's killed immediately. A few other people were killed, including the Irish Defence Attaché, who was present at the time. The perpetrators were all caught and executed. So the death of Sadat for his peacemaking brought us another time cover, which are always great for presentations, but to Mubarak. To Mubarak. A self-serving functionary with a tin ear. I don't have a soft spot for Mubarak. I never have done. I've been going to Egypt for 20 years now, and even 20 years ago, my local friends were telling me, this man's got to go one day. And I said, well, everybody goes one day. When is this day? Mubarak has not had a very good name in Egypt for a very long time, except for a certain elite group of friends who were involved in business, who profited from his rule. And Mubarak didn't even have the charisma of a Nasser or the vision, I would argue, of Sadat in trying to pursue peace, at least with Israel. This is him being sworn in 1981. 1981. Not quite as long ago as Alexander the Great's invasion, but still a considerable span of time for a single man to rule a country, from 1981 until 2011. So, no big events under Mubarak. I mean, nothing like the Suez Crisis, nothing like the wars with Israel. So instead of events per se, we're going to look at these general areas. The Iraq War, political Islam and social provision, population growth, which is absolutely crucial to understanding Egypt today, and then cronyism and other economic woes. Tell me, is cronyism a word used much in America, or is that something I've introduced to these shores? You use it here too? Oh, good. I didn't want to leave anybody behind with some of my quaint foreign expressions. Good, I'm glad you have cronyism too. So the Iraq War. This is obviously young Mubarak. This is not him. He didn't fight in the Iraq War. But again, I'm just showing him here in his uniform to re-establish again in our minds the idea that Egypt since 1952 was essentially a military dictatorship. Mubarak was in a suit most of the time, yes. So was Sadat, yes, granted, and Nasser. But it was the military that really controlled the country. And they still have a great deal of say in Egypt today. The Iraq War was important to Mubarak. He came out in support of the US-led mission to liberate Kuwait. It gained him a great deal of kudos with the West. As did... That's... anybody tell me? Go on, make an educated guess. Do you recognise the roundel, as it's called, these three circles? What are they representative of? Anybody know? No.
The Air Force.
Right, thank you. Whenever you see a roundel like this, it's an Air Force. You can pretty much be sure. Egyptian flag in the corner. It's not the Royal Air Force, sir. No. But yes, it has that similarity that it has a roundel. Mubarak is an Air Force man. That's why I threw this slide up. But I was saying the kudos he gained from the Iraq War in supporting the West and most Arab nations, it should be said. Those who didn't support it, I suppose Yemen was the most obvious one, a near neighbour. But again, that's a little outside of our purview. In the way that Nasser had stamped on the Islamist parties and any Islamist sympathies, Sadat had set a few of them free from prison. Sadat had tried to win over the Islamists to support his aim for a more representative democracy. Now, I don't think he was genuine in wanting party political democracy, Sadat, but he did make the gesture of releasing Islamists and he thought he could control them. As we have seen, they assassinated him. So, again, he misjudged that one. This is President Mubarak in Khartoum, capital of Sudan, meeting with the then and now President Bashar of Sudan. During this visit, there was an assassination attempt against Mubarak conducted by Sudanese Islamists. Don't forget, it was also during Mubarak's reign that Osama bin Laden was held up not a million miles from Khartoum. That was the centre of Al-Qaeda before most people knew what Al-Qaeda was all about. The man in the middle, anybody know him? He's not terribly well. His name is Anwar Sadat. He was Egypt's foreign minister for a long time, and there were calls for him to become the next president after Mubarak. There are pop songs written about Anwar Sadat. He's quite a hero. There was a pop song from, I guess it was the early O's, 2001, 2002, by an Egyptian artist whose name escapes me, and the song ran, in translation from the Arabic, "I hate Israel, but I love Anwar Sadat," which tells you about the dire state of Egyptian pop music more than anything else. So Anwar Sadat, there with Mubarak. Mubarak's line with the Islamists was basically to try and ignore them. He did allow Islamist parties. The Muslim Brotherhood remained banned. They were an underground party, but there were always, every rigged election that ever took place under Mubarak allowed Muslim Brotherhood candidates as long as they appointed themselves independents. So people in the West will have the analysis that say there were 70 Muslim Brotherhood seats in Parliament, but there weren't any. There were 0. There were 70 independents that were nominally Muslim Brotherhood. It's a fine distinction perhaps to us, but it mattered a great deal in domestic politics in Egypt. This is a single data point that we can draw out. It's an important one though, the earthquake that struck Cairo in 1992. Killed 545 people. It wasn't the world's strongest ever earthquake. It did quite a bit of damage. 50,000 people made homeless. What's more significant than the individual losses here is the fact that the government response was so slow and so tardy. Within an hour of the earthquake happening, Islamist groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood had tents set up to provide shelter. They had first aid stations basically on every other street corner in all of the poor districts of Cairo. They were giving out food, water, blankets, and they had provided shelter. The Egyptian government did next to nothing. Now think about it. One party has provided us with security, health, food, water, and the government, the state, the organisation to whom we turn for protection, has done next to nothing. It should come as no surprise that the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist groups are so very popular in Egypt, because they are providers. If somebody gives you something, you remember that in your hour of need, and when it comes to an election you will say, I remember them, they came to our neighbourhood and they stood with us, the poor people. It wasn't all about the cronyism at the top. One data point, as I say. I said we'd look at population growth in Egypt. Can you see the very bottom? 1900, 13 million people in Egypt. 1952, time of the revolution, so-called military coup, 22.23 million people. 71 up to 36. Today, 2012, 83 million. Forgive the justification. I create these slides in the Mac program Keynote. Anybody use Keynote? And I just converted them to PowerPoint before this evening's lecture. And so when converting them, it's shifted things down. I wouldn't be quite so sloppy as that, you understand? I'll check it next time. 83 million people living in Egypt today, and another 8 million Egyptians overseas. Huge population growth. And it has slowed down slightly in the past couple of years, but even accounting for a slowing down in population growth, it's significant. It's difficult, of course, knowing what to do with all these people, but under Mubarak, it seemed as though the government didn't really care what to do with these people. If they starve to death, so they starve to death. It's fewer people to worry about. There was certainly nothing in the way of social provision. And yet there was money in Egypt, and there still is. Not as much as there was 2 years ago, perhaps. But Egypt is in a unique position, both geographically and as a centre for the Arab world culturally. And the country's always fed off of this. It's always had very, what should we say, an innovative policy towards education. In Algeria on independence, they had to send thousands of Egyptian school teachers to Algeria. We mentioned last week about the street signs being in French. When they made them in Arabic, the Algerians couldn't read them. They relied on Egyptian school teachers to go to educate the Algerians how to read and write Arabic. You find Egyptians working throughout Saudi Arabia, both again as teachers and as engineers. Every other taxi you get into in Egypt, it's a doctor or an engineer driving that cab. Remarkable level of education, bright people, no decent jobs for them. And it's because of the cronyism. I like that word, obviously. Some key sector figures here from 2011. Tourism, 9 billion, down 30%. That's the government figure, down 30% on the previous year, 2010. I was speaking to the head of a major hotel chain in Egypt last January. Last January was, yeah. He said that occupancy in his hotels, famous American chain, they were down 80%. He said the claim of a 30% drop was just pie in the sky. He said 80% for him and all of his colleagues in other hotel chains. Suez Canal revenues were slightly up, as were remittances. $8.1 billion sent home from those 8 million Egyptians living overseas. Egypt relies on remittances. And that is to say, individual families rely on these remittances. If you're an Egyptian living in Washington, D.C., and you've got a brother or sister or mum and dad back home in Cairo, you're not sending your money to the government. You're not going to pay into Egyptian taxes. What a waste of time. You're going to send it directly to your brother or sister or mother or father. This, as you can appreciate, really skews any government's plans to have an effective tax base. There's $8 billion coming in here, but it's going directly to the people who will spend it on, well, whatever they choose, I suppose, and maybe that's right and proper. But the Morsi government is desperate now to try and raise tax. But nobody trusts the government because of the 60 years previous maladministration, I suppose. They can rely on the Suez Canal, but it's never going to go up that much. For an individual ship to go through, I mean, it depends on the tonnage of the ship, but something like the Queen Mary 2 pays $100,000 to go through the Suez Canal once. There aren't a lot of ships that are keen to make that journey. So these revenues, although they're slightly up at 5 billion, it's not enough to save Egypt. Anybody heard this name before? Ahmed Ez. Anybody? He was a steel magnate. That didn't mean he attracted steel to himself. That meant that he developed the steel industry in Egypt. He's now serving 10 years in prison for corruption, embezzlement and other things since the revolution. Well known throughout Egypt to ordinary Egyptians, ordinary Egyptians who read newspapers. He's well known as a crook. Great friend of this guy, Gamal Mubarak, one of President Mubarak's sons. The man who many people thought would become president after his father, Hosni Mubarak. Speaking here at the World Economic Forum, when I say crook and when you see World Economic Forum, I'm not putting any subliminal messages. I don't want you to get that impression. It's just that Gamal Mubarak was seen very much as the young man with a knowledge of economics who was going out to the world, a bit like Saif al-Gaddafi in the case of Libya, promoting a more liberal economic agenda for Egypt, telling everybody that not to worry, everything's going to be fine. But the fact is that everything wasn't fine in Mubarak's Egypt. The repression was palpable. And when we think about influence, and we have the Ahmed Ezes and we have the Gamal Mubaraks, we mustn't forget the Field Marshal Mohammed Tantawis, retired. Tantawi was head of the council, the Supreme Military Council that took over after Mubarak's fall. Now, Tantawi and all of his friends, as we will see after the break, which is coming up very shortly, fear not, have a great deal invested in Egypt. and a great deal invested in themselves. It is reckoned, and it's impossible, let's say it's impossible to get an accurate figure, but it is reckoned that 40% of Egypt's GDP at the moment is passing through military-owned companies. The military aren't just involved in manufacture of small arms and ammunition and things like this, but they have food companies, they have construction companies, they have transport companies, manufacturing. And all of those companies can operate on a much cheaper return than a company would in the free market, because they very often use conscripts to do some of the work for them. It's a bit like employing slaves and then saying, well, I can put in a cheaper bill for this job than my competitor can. It's not sustainable, as I'm sure you will appreciate, even without further degrees in economics. A quick assessment then of Nasser, Sadat and Mubarak. Nasser, safe to say, can you see that? That's the Cairo Tower. It stands in the middle of an island in the middle of the Nile in Cairo. Beloved egotist and failure. That would be my one-line assessment of Nasser. He lost Egypt, the Sinai. He kept the country at war. And people love him. Sadat, the man who got Sinai back for Egypt, the one who signed peace, the one who made great strides to getting the Egyptian economy off of a wartime footing, an unmourned peacemaker. I mentioned the Pharaoh line earlier. This is a line of Sadat's. He said that Nasser and I were the last pharaohs. He said this proudly. It wasn't a sort of an embarrassed, oops, shouldn't be doing that now, should we? No, he was proud of the fact that if democracy was going to come to Egypt, he would give it. He didn't, as it happens, but were it to be the case, it would have come from his hand. That obviously is not how democracy works. So, you know, his reputation as an autocrat is well deserved. And then Mubarak, the unloved factotum, he didn't actually say, I can't hear you. That's my line. I'm sure he said it at some point to somebody. But when the people were, not just in the month before the revolution, but for years people were demanding greater economic liberalisation, greater representation in Parliament, he kept saying, I don't understand what the people want. There's a lovely joke that was circulating in Egypt during the revolution, when Mubarak is watching the television, and he says to his right-hand man, what are all those people doing in Medan Tahrir? And his right-hand man, rather sort of worried, says, President, they're having a farewell party. And he said, oh, why? Where are they going? That was how Mubarak viewed the protests until the very last minute. He didn't hear the siren calls. He didn't know it was he who was shortly to be leaving. So we brought full circle. Does anybody recognise this particular brand? There's a Freudian slip. Brand of bland cheese, La Vache qui rit. This was Mubarak's nickname for years in Egypt. I mean, he's still known as La Vache qui rit. His face people likened to a bovine stupidity. That's how Egyptians would address Mubarak. As you can see from this sign, La Vache qui rit, Mubarak. Rather clever, huh? Play on words. These signs appeared all over town. Out, step down Mubarak. He was not really a popular man in Egypt. Sadat had his followers, but when he died, nobody really mourned. Nasser still has his followers. In Medan Tahrir, I will show you photos another time, people holding signs of Nasser, still in Medan Tahrir, demanding a return to Nasser's days. But for Mubarak's fall, nobody really mourned him. Omar Suleiman, and an unnamed character in the background. There were lots of jokes going around about the unnamed man in the background too. Anyway, Omar Suleiman. Do you remember I mentioned earlier that Mubarak was the vice president of Sadat, and Sadat was the vice president for Nasser? This man, Omar Suleiman, was vice president for 16 days. I don't know what his pension looks like after 16 days. 25th of January, the big protest starting in Cairo. Mubarak promises concessions. he says, "I will appoint a vice president." There is another story told in Egypt, a very popular joke, that Nasser was so paranoid about somebody taking power, he found the stupidest man in the country and made him vice president. That was Sadat. And then Sadat, learning from Nasser, decided that he would find the stupidest man in the country and make him his vice president. And he picked Mubarak. And Mubarak never had a vice president because he couldn't find anybody more stupid than himself. Well, that's the story they tell in Egypt. Until vice president for 16 days, Omar Suleiman. Ironically, of course, Omar Suleiman was head of intelligence in the country. So the joke kind of rolls on and on. Military intelligence being the original oxymoron, I'm told. So there we have it. A rather glum-looking Mubarak in prison on trial. The Pharaoh slide applies just as much, I think, to Mubarak as it did to Sadat, as it did to Nasser. But Mubarak, if he wasn't actually losing control, he never had the same degree of control that his predecessors had. But at 29 years and 4 months, it's not a bad run at ruling the country. The longest ruler of Egypt after Muhammad Ali was Mubarak. And just to put that into some perspective, in terms of years, it's easy to talk in decades, but when we think of individuals, I think it's instructive. So Mubarak was, if I can say, on the throne of Egypt under Obama, Bush Jr., Clinton, Bush Sr., Reagan, and Carter. Carter. I mean, that's like ancient history in American political terms. And Mubarak was there for all of them. You can understand why people get tired. And now we have Morsi. And the Morsi government and Morsi's Egypt will be a lecture for another day. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry we went over my intended